Apple diseases in New York. Okay, let's talk about apple scab. This is a cool, wet climate disease, and for the moment, we have a cool, wet climate. But I've recently seen a couple webinars that says we might have a more erratic climate with erratic heavy rains, perforated with periods of drought. If that doesn't sound like 2020 or some of the more recent years, that might be something to think about as we consider apple scab for the future. It really likes cold, wet weather, and that's where the disease pressure comes in. And one of the things that we're finding is that cold, wet weather right at petal fall to 10 to 15 millimeters is becoming a trend that we're seeing in recent years of when the real pressure hits place. Even though we think about this disease as happening right at green tip, it seems that that other period is starting to become a really interesting area. A lot of the cultivars that we like to eat and plant are susceptible to apple scab, and many instances it can require as many as 10 fungicide applications per season, particularly when we get into a really wet season. And it seems like we're due for one in recent years. What you can see on the left is sort of what it looks like on terminal leaves as the lesions get really heavy. And, these are some really fully developed cluster leaf lesions on the right side. And it just becomes scabby and bumpy. But that's not the part we're worried about. We're worried about those lesions on fruit. And the leaves are nice to show at this point because one of the main things we can do to really help reduce apple scab pressure in the season is use a little bit of urea and leaf shredding. And this will tear up the leaves that are on the ground right in the spring or, in the fall as you move into fall if you have more time then to do it. It's often debated about when to do it. Now, if you're in an orchard situation, you're having a hard time getting into the orchard because of snow or wet weather in the early spring, then the fall is your time to do it. Another thing that we often do, and we'll talk about it later in the apple scab section, is really look at those delayed dormant copper applications right there at silver tip or bud break. These can help reduce any inoculum that may be starting to grow with the warm weather and the buds, but also this sort of relies on you being able to get into those orchards. And wet springs still are a possibility, even if we end up having droughts later on. So what else do we know about it? We have fungicide resistance to nearly all of the single-site fungicides. These are the fancy fungicides that target genes and fungi. However, we do have good susceptibility to the SDHIs. This is what apple scab looks like on your fruit if it ever gets to this phase. In this case, this is probably a complete loss of fresh market production once you receive this much apple scab. Usually it might just be the isolated lesion here and there. And there can be a variety of morphologies, which in some cases can be confusing. Is that apple scab or is that something on? In this case, this is an early apple scab infection right here, and the lesions have expanded in a stranger look. When they're small and more broken up, usually indicates a much later, probably around petal fall to 10 to 15 millimeters. The sad part about losing resistance is we don't have any curative or reach back activity, which means we need to stay on our toes and maybe look at forecasts to see when the big infection periods are going to come in. And then that's the first thing that goes with fungicide resistance is that ability to go in after an infection event and apply a fungicide. And we should always begin thinking of forward and protecting against apple scab when the big rains are coming. Even if you don't follow the models, you can use the weather forecasts to really get an idea of when it's going to be nasty outside, and good weather for apple scab. Cold and wet is the keys. So what we end up doing in many instances is just making a sort of a constant protective coating of two of our multi-site broad-spectrum protectants, Captan and Mancozeb. And let's leave apple scab for a moment, just really brush on some of the big problems. We have fire blight. It's becoming increasingly problematic in New York. As we begin to move into high density or super spindle plantings, we're having a lot of trees to the acre. That means each one of our acres costs a lot more than it did 10 to 15 years ago when we had 300 or 400 trees to the acre. Now our acreage is costing a lot. And it's very high value, and we need to protect it. The other thing that's exciting or maybe worrisome about this type of planting style is the trees are they're seemingly younger looking, they're smaller, they're in this highly productive state. We want them to constantly put out fruiting wood that's small, succulent, and in many instances the bloom is protracted and happens a little bit later and later. It may start earlier, but in some of these young plantings of this type, you might end up seeing bloom get pushed into June and later when temperatures are really hot. And also the tissue is going to be vigorous and growing very quickly. Resistant rootstocks are helpful in really large, maybe older type cider plantings where you might have bigger, bushier trees. But in this instance, once you get fire blight on that leader, it's best to get it out of there because it's just going to be a source of inoculum. You might even think of it as a sprinkler of fire blight when the rains come later in the summer. So it's best to get that tree out of there once it gets as much fire blight as you see in this picture to the right, and it gets in that central leader. You might think, oh, let's get that out of there because it could just be a problem later on. And nearly everything that we have that we want to grow is susceptible to fire blight. So what happens? The first phase is a blossom blight phase, and that's not great because it can reduce the season's crop. It also helps thins the crop for you, but it's not the type of thinning that we want to achieve. And how we defeat it is we usually go after it with forecast antibiotic applications. Shoot blight is one of the most devastating and scary parts of it because now the fire blight is inside the wood and it will just sort of run rampant throughout the entire tree, running to all the active growing components and shoots, and could even show up in your fruit. And once it's inside the tree, it's hard to get rid of. The best thing you can do is prune it out, or you can attempt to use growth regulators like hexadione calcium to get rid of it. Rootstock blight is another potential problem, and this is where the rootstocks really come into, the resistant ones really come into play. And this can help you end up avoiding an infection of a rootsucker or something on the tree, because once you might even, if it's a small infection on a rootstock sucker, can end up bringing an entire tree down, while a minor shoot infection might be able to be pruned out in the scion varieties. And the final phase that one can find, and we may have it if we have more summer storms, is trauma blight. And it can be wounds by hail, wind. Even a heavy windstorm can be enough to damage shoots. And if there's an oozing shoot somewhere, it might end up getting fire blight into one of these wounds, such as you see here. This is some hail damage. And don't forget deer. Deer can damage the crops, and if they're actively growing while they're damaged, you might end up getting fire blight spread by deer. And then this is the opportunity where you might still use antibiotics a little bit, but it's another good time to just protect the crop with copper. Once the crop has been damaged and completely ruined by something like deer or hail, you might as well use copper in this instance and not risk the lifespan of your antibiotics. Powdery mildew. This is a problem in warm, dry periods in the spring and summer, and this is becoming a bigger concern if you begin to think about the climate of New York changing, where we might have more drought periods or periods of intense storms followed by periods of drought. It likes just a little bit of water, and it likes dry weather. And we're kind of concerned that this may be a bigger problem in the future as well. And a lot of the cultivars that we have will get powdery mildew, particularly some of the new fancy ones that are really tasty to eat. And it's one of these things that as we continue to have sort of periods of dry weather or dry spots in recent years, you could have this disease sort of run ravaging through the orchard and just sort of devastating everything if you aren't keeping on top of your summer covers. You might think, well, it's gotten really hot and dry, I don't need a lot of summer covers. But if there's some powdery mildew out there, it may continue to infect as long as your shoots are growing. It's one of those things that we're wondering if we have fungicide resistance in it. In the old days, we used a lot of DMI fungicides, and they were so effective against mildew, it was kind of like we never saw it. Now it becomes a situation where the DMI fungicides just don't even seem to solve the problem, such as this particular block you can see down here. The leaves may look sort of spindly, and in distance you might think, is that herbicide damage? But as you step away from the tree, you might begin to see they all look a little bit white and defoliated in sort of my ratty trees that we have in our orchards. And this was a DMI program that didn't really work that well. We had a different group of fungicides, the QOIs, that are respiration inhibitors. And these seemed less effective. They were pretty good in the 90s, but now they seem quite awesome. But when I go back and look at my earlier tests, they're definitely less effective than they should have been. And the SDHI fungicides that we use now against apple scab, because they are fairly good and there's no resistance yet, they're just not as effective as a baseline level as some of the other things. And what we're often tempted to do is put a little bit of sulfur, and that's always effective. There won't be resistance to this in the tank, but we could get other problems with sulfur, injury if it gets too hot, or it may make the orchard unpleasant if you have a pick your own or other sort of situations. So what else is coming with the summer? If we get more weird, erratic rain in the summer, we may run into problems with things like glomerella leaf spot, Marsanina leaf blight. A lot of these issues themselves are or things that might happen when we turn away from single site fungicide and rely only on old protectants and stuff that aren't well managed by the old protectant fungicides. And sometimes if we have weather for them or in an organic situation, these can show up. This is some Marsanina leaf blight here. I took pictures of in China, and this is Glomerella leaf spot from North Carolina State. And we can begin to see these here, particularly in organic plantings, and they can lead to complete defoliations of orchards if they're not managed. And typically they get managed by apple scab fungicide programs. But now it may be that the timings for these may overlap. They may be slightly different, and some of the materials that are effective may be different. And that's why we might end up seeing them in New York. As I mentioned before, they're a bigger problem in organic operations. And anytime you have to rely on just protectant fungicides or sort of broad spectrum things, they're not going to go in and sort of surgically remove these types of diseases from the orchards as we have with some of the QOIs and DMIs. And so it makes sense in this case to bring a lot of these different fungicides back. They may not be effective against apple scab, but they might get frog eye leaf spot. They might get Marsanina, or they might get Glomerella. So it's kind of important to sort of rotate these in sort of an integrated manner to really get that high level of control. And in these other weird pathogens, they haven't been exposed to them that often. Either they're not here, or they're mildly invasive, or just the change in the climate is causing them to show up, and they don't have resistance yet, so they can be very good. The other thing that you can do with a lot of these is keep up with your good summer cover program in the sanitation. You see, all of these things are like the apple scab at some level. They're all in the same group of fungi. They're going to make leaves. Those leaves are going to fall on the floor. They're going to make sort of recalcitrant fruiting bodies, and if you're out there putting urea and shredding, you're going to get a lot of this taken care of at the same time. Unfortunately, many of the same pathogens, particularly like the one that's causing frog eye leaf spot shown here on these apples, can also cause fruit rots as well. And we have other things like fly speck sooty blotch, the bitter rot, the anthracnose pathogen. Some versions of that pathogen are the ones that cause Glomerella leaf spot. Different species nonetheless, but very similar in terms of being in the same genus, if you will. And then we have others, such as the black and white rot fungi, which are caused by Botrisphaeria and can cause a frog eye leaf spot. So this is a black rot right here. It's smooth, it's turgid. You can kind of rub your fingers on it. It feels hard, kind of like a peanut. But the white rot one, if you stick your finger on it, your finger will go inside. And then this is sort of fly speck sooty blotch that you can see here. Interestingly, many of these happen as latent infections, and that means you can't tell that you got them. What they end up occurring is oftentimes around bloom, or that 10 to 15 millimeter size that we're really worried about for fruit thinning. These are when the infections occur, and they sort of stay hidden. They don't make any symptoms, and they're waiting for that fruit to mature and get sugary, and maybe in the case of other things, get a nice cuticle where some of the sugars ooze out onto the wax and allow the diseases to take a foothold, if you will. Pre-harvest, they can also come at a second time, right when you get near harvest. You get a lot of rains at harvest. If we have one of these wet falls right around the time you're constantly trying to harvest your apples, and there's birds out and they're pecking holes in fruit, and maybe you had to get that last burn down herbicide in, and one droplet hits a speck on a fruit and ends up causing a problem. And this, what ends up happening is they can lead to post-harvest problems. They can either remain latent early on, or you can have a little pre-harvest infection that you didn't know that occurred, and then ends up leading to pack-out rejections. And they are going to be a bigger problem in warmer areas, warmer sandy areas. These pathogens that I've shown are bigger issues when you get to further south, like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and even maybe places like the Hudson Valley or Long Island. If you have sandier soils, all it could take is a little bit of wind blowing a sand particle, hits the fruit, or maybe a herbicide droplet, if it's a windier area, and the next thing you know, you have an awful sunken lesion of bitter rot. Or if there's a cultivar that's highly susceptible, the entire side can become sort of wrinkled and gross in that particular instance. Again, once we step away from the single-site, really highly specific fungicides, the multi-site protectant fungicides just aren't going to be as good. Some are, some aren't. It really just depends on the fungus involved. How do you beat these? You usually get rid of them by managing them with pedal-fall fungicides. That pedal-fall fungicide choice is going to be really important. If there's any potential damaging combination of materials, that might actually make you more predisposed to get infection by bitter rot. In this instance, this is where your single-site fungicides will come in. Generally, they're not as potentially phytotoxic, and they're more targeted to fungi. And so this is a good time to really pick a good single-site fungicide right at pedal fall. And then your summer fungicide programs. Watch and see what the rain is. Unlike the powdery mildew, these like rain. And if we're not having a lot, you can really extend your intervals. And one of the final things that we often recommend is that single pre-harvest fungicide application right before you pick them. Look and see which ones have the lowest PHI and the lowest residue potential, and use that last one so that they go into harvest and into storage and with a good level of protection on them before you begin to put them away for the winter. With that, that'll conclude our first sort of overview of the different diseases.